Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the very first EliteHR Masterclass. We're really excited to engage with all of you on a very chilly and wintry Friday morning. Thank you very much for joining us. We're excited to engage with you over the next 3 odd hours in, I think, in a very key topic. What does performance management in a new reality look like? And we've put some slides together. We're going to have a great conversation. This is an interactive session. The slides are there to provide structure to the conversation with the emphasis on it being a conversation. At Human Interest, we don't believe in death by PowerPoint. We believe that two-way communication is the best way of learning. So we strongly encourage you all to engage throughout the session. There are a couple of things that we would like to achieve, so certain learning outcomes that we are aiming for during the course of today's session, and I'll shortly talk you through that. On the call from Human Interest side, myself, Janko Kotzé. We also have our lead facilitator for the day, JP van Zittert. If you've been part of the EliteHR community and you've been following us and attending our live Q&A sessions, of which we had our third event last night, you are very familiar with JP. And then also contributing during the course of the morning, one of our colleagues, Ilana Bischoff, who is also on the call. Thank you very much again, and also for completing the registration form. We have a good feel for who is in the room. And just to make sure that, again, that technology is working, I want to ask you in the chat bar, just quickly, let's do something different. In the live Q&A, we're asking, where do we find ourselves? Let's do it slightly different, making sure that you find the chat functionality. Just fire away with your favorite color. As we find ourselves here, what is your favorite color? In the chat bar, what is your favorite color? Let's see. Blue, yellow, blue. Very specific, light pink. Do not have a favorite color. Okay, we need to work on that. Light pink, I say. Yellow. Depends on the mood. Okay, what mood are you in today, Trisha? Have a look at your mood ring. What does that tell you? Very inclusive from Marley. Thanks a lot. So we see the chat is working. We will be using the chat also as part of today's session and today's conversation. I see that we're all very well afraid with chat, so that really is great to see. A couple of rules of engagement. Okay, cameras off, microphones on mute until such time where you want to contribute. I think we're a nice small group, so it's not going to be necessary to make use of breakout rooms. We'll see how the session goes. There was also a question on whether it is being recorded. Yes, we are recording it. We will early or during the course of next week make it available on the Human Interest YouTube channel. So you can, if you connect with us on LinkedIn, you follow Human Interest on LinkedIn, you will see when that it is loaded. So what are we going to be discussing today? A couple of things. First of all, what is the trends in performance management? We want to really look at understanding the importance, why are we even having this conversation? Is performance management not this thing that was done in the 1960s, in the first industrial revolution? Is it still something that is applicable today? We want to look at, practical and influential case studies. So we have prepared a few that we want to share with you. What does the new age implementation of performance management systems look like? And I want to emphasize the concept of system. I think very often when we hear the word system, we think success factors, workday, whatever the case might be. We see a system as an interconnected, I want to say, ecosystem of behavior, technology, etc., etc. So what does that look like? We want to unpack some insights, strategies, and techniques that you can utilize to effectively manage and measure performance. You'll recall in our live Q&A last night, we spoke about making things visual and the importance of that. And then very importantly, as well as how do we use this process called performance management, really to enhance employee engagement. So those are the 6 things that we want to achieve today. I want to encourage you and invite you as we progress through this. There will be formal opportunities for Q&A and for engagement and activities, but please don't hesitate to make use of the chat functionality. At any point in time, if we say something that triggers a thought, triggers an idea, triggers a question, please fire away in the chat bar. I will be monitoring that as JP leads the facilitation, and we will then address those questions in those formal opportunities. So that is what we are planning to spend some time with you on until 12 o'clock. There will be formal comfort breaks. If you really need to take one, pop me a private message and we'll bring it in. We will monitor the virtual energy in the room, but we're going to aim for around about 10:30 for the first formal comfort break. But as I said, feel free to reach out to me. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Over to JP.
Thank you, Janko. Good morning, everyone. Forgive me for looking like I'm at a flight desk at the airport. Sometimes it just helps me manage noise around me and sounds and just hear everybody clearly. So welcome to today's workshop. Like Janko said, there's a couple of key things we want to discuss, take you guys through, and we really want to make it a conversational element. So if there's anything you want to raise or discuss, please put it into the chat box, and we'll also have an opportunity to kind of raise your hand if there's something that you want to ask or kind of contribute. This is a conversational session, so it's not just me death by PowerPoint. It's kind of trying to get the message across and kind of discussing what we are seeing out there. So if we kind of just take a step back and we kind of look at the intro of what's happening in the world, there's a couple of things that are driving the need for performance management. And the first one is currently technology is disrupting the world that we know of. And also we've got employees working remotely. So these kind of 2 trends are kind of converging at the moment. And performance management is more critical now than ever to clearly articulate what people need to do and how they need to do it, and support them in understanding how do they still add value to the business. Companies need to adapt to the new technologies, and how do you drive that adoption of the new technology within your space or within your business? The second one is, without talented and dedicated people, a business is little more than a great idea. And the way you get your talented and great people to contribute and keep contributing is by giving them regular feedback on where they are, telling them if they're on the right track. You can stimulate their growth and satisfaction. One of the key things we discussed in last night's Q&A was, what keeps millennials and Gen Zs in the workplace, and some of it is around growth opportunities and a growth path. And that's actually where performance management comes in, is identifying, where are my blind spots, where am I not performing, and where am I not contributing to the level that I need to, and then helping me grow and develop to actually get to that point. And then the last one is kind of crucial, preparing your employees for future disruption. A lot of businesses are going through operating model changes, strategy changes, and performance management is a very key tool in helping and assisting your employees prepare for these changes, understanding, on the other side of this change, what do I need to bring to the party? What do I need to deliver? What do I need to, and how do I need to come to the party? It's crucial in analyzing effectiveness. I think in the past, what has hampered performance management has kind of been, it hasn't been objective. It hasn't been designed in a way that allows me to trust the performance management system. It's been designed in a way to be subjective. If the person likes me or not, that kind of influences if I get a good score or not. And then kind of in the last couple of years, people have been trying to make it objective and kind of implementing a couple of things to try and make it more objective, which kind of has to a certain extent made it better, but also added or forced people to start having hard conversations, which in the past they didn't have to do, and now they feel uncomfortable. So now they're actually avoiding it because they're uncomfortable. So I think there's a couple of key things here that are coming to the forefront that is converging, that we need to be able to sit back and think, okay, how are we going to manage performance going forward in the new world of work? So that's kind of the key trends at a high level. I want to talk about kind of more detailed ones that are kind of coming in just to set the scene for today and kind of create the framework within which we're going to be working. So if I look at kind of our current trends in the world and kind of what we're seeing. The first one is kind of specifically to performance management, the emphasis on diversity and what type of skill sets, multi-skilled teams, multi-skilled backgrounds, different contexts, their contexts that are adding value to the business. And through performance management, we can actually document what that value add or that contribution is in the workplace. The second one is focus on reskilling with new technologies, new ways of work, working from home. There's a lot of reskilling that needs to be happened. And we need to know if that reskilling has actually happened and people are actually performing effectively within that space. There's a big push for digitization, and this has been a trend for the last 5 to 10 years, but even more now because I think people have got a better grasp of what digitization is. It's not just an ERP system that I put in and we are digitized. It's a whole shift in mentality and focus and thinking, and through performance management, that's what we're driving. Also redesigning benefits for COVID-19 landscape. A lot of people are looking at benefits and saying, "Oh, our benefits still applicable? Is this still meeting our employees' needs?" One, from a basic recovery or a protection perspective, and then also from a attraction perspective. Then also finding the leverage and developing trust. A key component of performance management is trust, it's feedback, it's discussions, it's helping me on my development journey. Continuous performance management will catch on. I think there's a lot of companies that have kind of tried to get rid of performance management, but at the same time replaced it with something that's very similar, but just with a different name. And with that, it just kind of creates confusion because every year there's a new system in place, there's a new performance management, and actually through incremental changes, we can actually shift the current system. Doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Tiny shifts over time actually will get you a point where people believe and see, okay, you're listening to my feedback and you're updating what you're busy with. The next one is people analytics will become essential. And this is kind of the key crux of performance management in the new world of work is how can we convert as much as possible from the performance management process into objective data that feeds into performance that we can then marry with development discussions. Also, an increased focus on individualized employee support. A lot of us have EAPs in place. That is one level of support. You've got primary, secondary, and tertiary support. That's tertiary, the person's already at burnout, the person's already at an emotional breakdown. That's where you bring them in. We can kind of prevent people from getting to burnout and getting to that level where they need that by simply having courageous and in-depth and regular performance conversations. A streamlined approach to learning and employee development. All of us know how performance management IDPs kind of play into performance management, but there's a broader picture here in terms of just having an IDP item on my performance management. And there's always this time of year that we spoke about last night where everybody's in a frenzy, putting their performance management agreements in place, putting their IDPs in place to meet the deadline. And in the rest of the year, nothing happens. So in the new world of work and the new performance management approach, we have to look at consistent conversations around that development. Then also rethinking job roles will increase employee growth and development. As people start looking at automation, as people start looking at new ways of work, workforce planning, there's a lot of focus on, are our jobs actually designed effectively and are they doing what they need to do? And also streamlining of work and removing kind of repetitive automatable kind of activities from the jobs. But with that also comes a rethink of what those KPIs are. So I can't just redo the job and then leave the KPIs where they were. I need to elevate those KPIs to a point where they're not just repetitive outputs, but actually providing value. And then the last one is kind of going beyond performance, and I kind of left the colon there to transition to the next slide. But performance management isn't just about measuring performance. It's much broader than that. It's a conversation around identifying the gap between the expected role output and where you currently are, an alignment between the teams and within your team. So I think the focus within PM is kind of thinking broader than just measuring a KPI, but thinking and bringing in a perspective of how do I support you to contribute value? So I think that's kind of the key things from a train perspective. Janko, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add from your side.
Yeah, I think JP, especially on that last one, in my experience, that is where many of the systems fail, is because managers and just people in general, and the mindset in general, they don't embrace that philosophy in which performance management is an enabling tool for an organization and for a leader to do exactly as you've stated. It is to help a person understand where are they at, help them consider where they can be, what is expected of them in their role towards contributing to the outcome required by the organization, but also bringing their aspiration into it, having a conversation around the gap then that exists, whether it is from a current performance perspective or whether it is from a potential future development that is required to close the gap, and then to support continuously, and you'll see throughout the presentation how we talk about that, them in moving that dial. That, unfortunately, in my experience, is not the mindset of many managers. The mindset is very much, we need to have a conversation. HR said that at this time, this is your rating for bonus and increase, and then there's complaints, and you need to have these mechanisms of forums and moderations and what, too mechanistic. At its truest form, it should be a coaching conversation to close that gap. And we have a exciting opportunity on our hands, and also just looking at the people on the call and people watching this eventually on YouTube. That is the exciting challenge, is how do we shift that? Remember last night we spoke about what is required from a change management perspective. It's not, we don't require change management in the new world of work, we require change leadership. And that is exactly here. It's not so much performance management, it is performance leadership that is ultimately required, to move the dial, to effectively use and create a new way in a new reality.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe we can bring our guests today on the call, and in the chat box, we've listed a couple of things here, but there's a lot of things impacting the workplace. If you had to think of your workplace and where you are now, what are kind of the trends you've identified that are impacting your workplace and could potentially impact how you do performance management? So just in the chat box, put down if there's anything that we've missed, anything that you want to potentially add that you feel maybe could be of value to the broader group. Give it like 2 minutes to see if there's anything that comes through. Not, so it seems like we've done some good research. Okay, so we're going to go into our first activity today. Kind of have a bit of a conversation. The first one there speaks to what extent have you, the company, work for implemented initiatives that align with the current trends, mention the trends, and then briefly discuss some of the initiatives that you in the company you work for implemented in line with the current trends. Yep, hesitancy to have honest conversations. What other initiatives have you guys implemented to kind of address these trends that we've mentioned above? Anything into the chat box? See if there's anything coming through from a hand.
So again, I really want to encourage the audience here. We don't want this to be a lecture. We can easily put our lecture hats on, and we're comfortable to do that. But we really want to engage in the conversation. So to JP's point, think about, and it might not just be your company. It might be, we all have friends, we all have colleagues, and we talk, around the braai about, oh, my manager now wants me to do this, or our organization have now implemented that. I really want you to consider and share, because this is also a collective learning opportunity for all. What initiatives have they implemented, to really keep up with the trends? So what is the trend, and what have your organization done?
Using it as a, see, there's an old trend there around using it as a punishment session.
So if I can quickly just unmute myself.
Thanks, Marley.
Performance management for me, it's a very new thing. I haven't had any experience yet in the field, so I'm here for learning. But what I've picked up on conversations that I've had is that most companies see it as a tick box exercise. Obviously, we know that. But kind of the thing of when we do give ratings, it's you're not allowed to rate your team high. There's one top performer and that's it. There's no, high performing team because the connection between incentives and high performance is not necessarily correctly linked up. So yeah, that's what I've picked up.
Thanks a lot, Marley. You mentioned and you're touching a very philosophical point, and we can probably spend the entire 3 hours just talking around that, which is some organizations use a forced distribution curve, which I don't pretty much like and support, but it talks to your point where, no, looking at the size of our population, looking at your normal distribution curve, and I'm going with the assumption that the audience is familiar with the concept of a distribution curve, we can only have 3%, sitting over there. And I fundamentally disagree with that. The second thing is, where, you very often have a system of ratings. I don't know, let's say 5-point scale. But no one ever uses the 5. Okay, which let's say that is significantly exceed expectations. That is some terms that we've come across. Now you can't give a 5. Okay, then, but why do you have it then? So if you're not allowed to give a 5, why is that actually part of your rating scale? JP, you can respond to some of the the questions coming in here. I see some use of spider graphs, really to sort of display results, an attempt to make it a bit visual.
And I think a lot of companies have kind of moved or tried to move towards an environment. Gosh, someone's alarm just went off behind me. Move towards an environment where they're trying to get to a point where they are, from a human capital perspective, forcing multiple ratings by having that scatter plot, trying to drive the outcome that they're trying to achieve by putting in kind of regulations and guidelines around it. Which I think is a step in the right direction. I think it's more the execution that comes to answering, is it actually working? Because to a certain extent that can force people just to complete it, and then you have multiple scatter plots that doesn't actually tell you anything. But definitely, I think also the normal fear with performance management is one, remuneration and the impact on my bonus and increases, and 2, if I'm not performing, then it's a tool used to get rid of me. Yeah, I think
as you collect your thoughts there, I'm having a chuckle here at one of the comments coming through. We have a 1 to 4 scale. 3 is exceeds expectations, and 4 is far exceeds. I'm still trying to figure out the difference. That's exactly part of, aligned to some of the conversation we had last night. And I think aligned to my comment as well is you have this, but okay, so what is the difference then? Do you then allow half points? Because if you've got a 4-point scale and you allow half points, technically you've got an 8-point scale. Another comment, nobody are allowed to give themselves a 4. So you're not allowed to use this part of the rating scale. So why is it part of the rating scale? And if you've got this rating scale, what differentiates one from the other? Is it just me? Is it perception? Because then it's completely subjective, which is why you will see some of the case studies we're going to talk to, people attempted to throw it out because of the subjectivity. So yeah, is it easy? No, it's not easy. But can we make a difference? Yes, we can.
Oh, it's a nice long response. It is a stigmatized process, Helena, because it's been kind of tried to be fixed over so many years, and everybody around the braai or at the restaurant or wherever you meet talk about performance management, and everybody has met someone or knows someone or has been someone who has been unhappy by their performance review. So I think it's a process that touches every single person, and somewhere in your life, hopefully not, but somewhere in your life, you would have had the experience of someone rating you unfairly. And it negatively impacts kind of your perception of the whole process as a whole, because ultimately you just want to be given feedback around your accurate performance, not necessarily on someone's perceived idea of your performance.
JP, I just want to share, you know, I'm looking at Helena's comment, and Helena, thank you very much for your comprehensive input there. I'm going to say, let that be a standard for thoughts from the others as well. Very much aligned with your experience. And yes, there has been some attempts where, you know, it's about team-based, etc. You know, that is important, but there's also risks associated with that. You know, so I want to share two examples, JP, if I may, personal experience. I'm all for team-based metrics. I think that is important. However, I don't think it can be at the expense of individual contribution. Why do I say that? So I worked for a global consulting firm. We were measured to death in terms of the types of metrics and performance areas that you need to have. And at an individual level, I performed well. You know, so I exceeded expectations, whatever that meant, across all. So certain things were quite clear. So there's a revenue target. I exceeded individual revenue target by 200%. But then because the group, the entire team, you know, with offices across the country, didn't meet a certain KPI, that negatively impacted, let's say, my bonus, okay? Which meant that for a significant period of time, I had no financial reward for the individual effort that I put in. And that's, you know, if you're familiar with Victor Froome, the expectancy theory, you know, it plays into that, where if you don't expect to get a certain result, you are less likely to provide a certain level of input. So I was actually treated exactly the same as people that did not meet their expectations. You know, so why do I need to go the extra mile? You know, so we need to make sure that there's both team metrics, and last night we spoke about leadership development and the trend of a network of teams. So that is important. We also need to acknowledge individual effort. The second experience I want to share, also with a previous international employer, where there's sort of that subjectivity and where the ratings was coming from. And that's how, you know, personality and personal clashes can play. And I was on a project, and right from the get-go, my style of work did not align with my supervisor's style of work. And I saw some challenges. So bar the fact that within our team, we had a 60% turnover, you know, and the company leadership just let that slide, you know, that's on them. But I was proactive. So I had a conversation with superior, and I said, look, we're coming up for performance ratings. This is what is going to happen. I'm going to get these types of rating. Here's my evidence of 3 years of the type of rating. And exactly what happened, because there was a personality clash, the leader that I worked with wasn't mature enough to take that out. So I was rated quite low. Fortunately, you know, there were certain contextual factors taken into account, and it was overruled. But again, just shows you the impact that a manager, if a manager is not competent, that they can have on team, on climate, on ratings, etc.
I think also what was raised here is 360s. I think that's also it can be a very powerful tool in terms of performance ratings. I think, but you need to have a culture of honest feedback. You need to have a culture of people feeling comfortable to rate people how they see them. Otherwise, you kind of get this average score on your 360s for most of the things, if people aren't comfortable in kind of driving the honest conversation. But thank you everyone for participating. I think that was a good start to today. I want to kind of go into why do we need import performance management? I think that's been a big conversation over the last couple of years, is do we actually need it? And I think there's been a couple of case studies, and everybody would be aware of them, of companies trying to take performance management away, completely stop it, realizing that it doesn't work without it, try to bring it back in a different format, trying to de-link it from certain aspects. I know Netflix is a very popular example of completely de-linking it from compensation and making it purely a developmental conversation. But they've also had some stigma attached to how they run their performance management in terms of a fear culture, where they see themselves as a high-performing culture, and if you don't fit in, then you don't belong here, which also creates kind of a certain culture on the other side. So I think, when you're looking at performance management, it's important to look at what your culture looks like and what performance management within that looks like. So I think if we look at performance management, the first thing that I want to do is just, what do you guys think is the purpose of performance management? Why do we do performance management? In the chat box, put in a comment, what is the purpose of performance management? Is performance management and the many hours that goes in towards activity really necessary? So let's get a quick response from everyone there. What is the purpose of performance management? Why do you see it being there?
JP, that's such a valid question. I'm really interested to see, the delegates' response here. I think very often in HR, we fall into that trap, monkey see, monkey do. If you really ask a person, but why are you doing it? Have we really thought about that? Is it just because we have to? Okay, but why? So really interested to see what people are saying here. Is it just because it's expected? Is it really adding value? If you think it's adding value, how do you know it is adding value? Have you really deeply considered not just performance management, but across the entire employee life cycle, why we are performing certain activities and how that is contributing to employee engagement and creating an environment where people can thrive and where the company actually achieves their objectives?
So we've got a couple of responses here to make sure that employees still doing what they're employed to do. Ensure that employee contributes to the mandate of ExCo to live our vision and mission, to make sure the employee is still working towards the bottom line. Basically determine if the people are doing what they're supposed to do, see if they can be promoted, to evaluate person's performance and to close the gap. Purpose to help you understand your development areas and set up development plans for the next period of time and determine your salary increase bonus. To facilitate one-on-one conversations with managers and employees, for managers to see where they should be providing more hands-on support and input for employees to get development suggestions from Janko or manager. Where I'm in poor, where I need to improve, what is expected of me, and identify training opportunities. Ilana, do you want to add?
Yes, I just want to add there. So just from my personal point of view, in terms of the purpose of performance management, is when you are employed by a business, it's absolutely a two-way conversation or two-way contract. And I think most companies get it quite right in terms of managing performance. So are you still actually performing according to what your job requires of you, looking at the bottom line? We give you this rating, this is your bonus, this is your performance, or your development opportunity. But if I think about it from my own perspective, the reason for performance management is when I work for a certain company in a certain role, I would also like to grow. So I've got a certain potential and I would like my manager to provide feedback on that so that I can understand how I can grow into certain positions or what areas I can develop. So for me, it's a very personal thing in terms of my potential and how I can grow towards that. And of course, linking that to your job, to what is required of you, to the vision or the strategy of the company. But I think it's very much lost in translation that companies forget about what the employee actually wants and that they've got a specific potential that they would also like to reach within that role or going forward then. So that's just from a personal perspective, how I see performance management.
And I think, Ilana, you brought in such a key narrative there that we need to consider is because we are within human capital and we work from the employer's perspective. When we look at performance management, we're looking at how do we drive the employer's mandate or kind of what they're trying to achieve through performance management. But there is two sides to the story. There's the business's expectation of performance management, and then there's the employee's expectation of performance management. And some businesses have it right, like, are you delivering against the contract that you signed? You know, where are you slipping? We need to address it and correct it to make sure we're getting out of it what we've agreed on. But then also from an employee's perspective, there's an expectation of, I'm doing what I can, tell me where I'm missing something, or, you know, I want to become a future leader, so help me formulate my KPIs or my targets or my outcomes to help me get there. Show me how to close the gap. I am in my role, I might not know how to get to the next level, but I want to get there. Guide me. And basically what that performance conversation is putting down the plan to help them get there. Definitely, it is very important, Trisha, to add a performance development plan. It is a cornerstone of the conversation that you're having, is the development plan and how to get there. So I think if I want to just, and I've kind of tried to make this nice and easy and digestible. And so the key thing for us around performance management is kind of lead, respond, measure, and align. And the first one that we speak there about is kind of lead. You know, it's through formal and informal processes. Performance management is there to lead employees in terms of where they should be going. It's to lead the business. It's to lead around what is the expected outputs. What are we trying to achieve? And to give guidance to employees. The next one is to respond. There's a lot of external factors happening in the marketplace, and you know, performance management is actually a tool to help us respond to these changes. A lot of people see performance management as this rigid kind of process once a year. And if you do it once a year, you can't respond to what's happening in the market. You can't respond to what's happening with competitors, changes in legislation, changes in actually your internal projects and processes. And so by the time you get to your performance discussion, everything has moved and shifted on the table, and you're trying to still assess it against what the initial setup was. So I think it's important to also see it from that point. And that should give you a shift in terms of how performance management should be to allow us to be able to respond to what's happening. It's also about measuring. There's a very, very popular quote that spoke about what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And for us, it's about coming together and understanding, you know, what gets measured gets managed. And the last one was kind of a line, and there's a very famous CEO, Jack Welch from GE, that said that for performance management, he had 250,000 employees in his workplace. So there's humanly no way that he can get to everyone. And performance management was for him to make sure that everybody's pulling in the same direction. For a company to be sustainable in the new world of work with the economic factors that we have at the moment, you cannot afford to have people pulling in the wrong direction. You cannot have people performing unnecessary tasks that are not actually adding to the business. We also I presented the other day at the wellness conference around, you know, a lot of companies, because of the economic strain, has actually reduced headcount or cut back on vacancies, which means that the current employees are actually having to work longer hours to get the work done. And it's so important to actually make sure that those employees are aligned to what we're trying to achieve and what they are trying to achieve, to ensure that they're not doing unnecessary work. We've got a question here around, do you think PM will have to adapt to different generations' feedback receptivity, or is this not really a big issue? I think it's definitely a key focus point if you are thinking of giving feedback, and we'll get to feedback later in the session around how do we structure feedback effectively. But definitely, you know, I think fundamentally feedback is important. How you do that feedback speaks to generations. Older generations might want to have a sit-down conversation and have more of a formal conversation, where younger generation wants real-time feedback, dashboards, interactive conversations, focus groups, chat forums. There's different ways of facilitating feedback. Then Elizabeth said, on the point of respond, what are your thoughts about companies keeping pre-COVID-19 company KPIs in place? Should they relax sales targets knowing that the original target is less achievable? If they have not, I'll be very concerned. A key thing for companies is scenario planning and reforecasting. What makes sense in our world. And if you don't then align performance management and KPIs, then you misalign to what the business new objective is. A lot of companies had a significant knock on their revenue and their targets and their budgets. Now you're still measuring on the previous ones. So your ability to effectively respond to changing market segments is actually what needs to be done. You need to reforecast, look where we are, what's achievable, then cascade that down into the business, make sure everybody's aligned to what we're trying to achieve now, and then drive the performance from an HR perspective, from a business perspective, but also close the gap for employees in terms of understanding what they need to do. So those are the four pillars, if I can put it that way, of performance management. And I want to go to a section now where we talk about some case studies around companies that have, I don't want to say best practice, I want to say leading practice. So what are the companies that are starting to get this right doing? Best practice just always means everybody is doing it. Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. But leading practice is what is working and what do we see working in the market. So performance management case studies. Everybody would know these companies. So maybe not Cargill. Maybe everybody's not familiar with this one. So if we look at the first one, which is Google, it's no surprise that Google's here. They're very innovative in their systems and their management. And they are normally trendsetters in everything around what they do. And the performance management process relies on data and analytics. So remember, the first point we touched on from a trend perspective is bringing in objective information, bringing in analytics, bringing in data. So if we just look there, when assessing the performance management, they use data. They launched a project dedicated to assessing their managers, which has led to a thorough training and future development process that sets managers and employees up for success. They follow the OKR system, which basically speaks to objectives and key results. So I'm not measuring, if I can break this down to an easier example, I'm not measuring how many files you file on a daily basis. I don't measure, the work that you're doing. I'm measuring the output that you achieved. Is your filing effective? Not how many files do you file a day. And the principle behind OKRs is, what is our key objectives we're trying to achieve? And then what is the key results we need to achieve to align to that? The next one is Facebook, another tech trendsetter. Their performance management process puts a heavy emphasis on peer-to-peer feedback. So 360s that we spoke about earlier. That's why I said 360s can be such a good tool in terms of performance feedback. It's just making sure you've got a culture around it. They're able to use that feedback to see how well teams are performing, and understand where collaboration is happening and what is not. Then also they have developed an internal software to provide continuous real-time feedback. This helps employees solve issues before they become problems. And I want to just stop on this one quickly. And I think as human capital, we've lost our understanding to a certain extent of our role in the process. We've defaulted almost to an extent to us being the governor of performance management in the workforce. We need to govern this process. We need to drive this process. But actually, we should just be facilitating something that happens normally. Putting tools in place, putting systems in place that help people do it easier, rather than telling them it has to be done. So two trends. So we've got outcomes-based KPIs that are one of the trends from Google. We've got peer feedback from Facebook. And then if you look at Cargill, is a Minnesota-based food producer and distributor with over 150,000 employees, and serves to demonstrate that even huge companies can ditch unwieldy performance appraisals and institute a new system. Cargill created the everyday performance management system. Again, regular feedback. The system is designed to be continuous, centered around positive employee-manager relationship, with daily activity and feedback being incorporated into conversations that solve problems rather than rehash past actions. The everyday performance system had an overwhelmingly positive result, with 69% of employees stating that they received feedback that was useful for their performance development, and 70% reporting that they felt valued as a result of continuous performance conversations. So what that kind of marries is the conversation we had earlier around, yes, it's important to drive daily performance management from a company perspective, but also giving daily feedback, making small adjustments rather than big drastic adjustments on performance management. So we've got OKRs, outcomes-based, regular feedback, and checkpoints and conversations. That is a key trend. If we look at the next one, Adobe, different pronunciations, calculated that managers were spending about 80,000 hours a year on performance reviews. This is obviously in total, not one manager. Only to have employees report that they left those reviews demoralized and turnover was increasing as a result. Seeing that the system was not working, Adobe put forward a plan to kind of relook their performance management. And they took a bold leap into a performance management system that began with firstly training their managers on how to do performance management check-ins and provide actionable guidance, which is a big factor we always forget to look at, is can managers actually provide effective performance feedback? Then the company gave managers the leeway they needed to effectively lead. Managers was given much more freedom in how they structured their check-ins and employee review sessions, as well as more discretion in salary and promotions. Employees are often contacted for pulse surveys, a way for the leadership team to measure that the individual managers are leading their teams well. So a key thing here that I want to raise is it's not just the manager reviewing the employee, which kind of creates a power dynamic of I'm rating you, so you don't have much to say, where if there's a reverse feedback within this process, it kind of keeps managers honest to a certain extent, or it puts a mechanism in place to ensure that they are. One of the many positive results is that this has been a 30% cut of involuntary turnover due to a frequent check-in program. Again, same principles, frequent check-in, managers driving the performance conversation, not HR. Then having feedback and then reverse feedback as well as a key component. The last one we want to check on is kind of just Accenture as an example. They've got about 330,000 people. And before I go on, I also want to raise something that you'll see here is these are companies that are struggling with a process on a mass scale. It is 300,000 employees, 150,000 employees. And for them, solving a problem at this scale means that it can't be some HR team somewhere in the corner driving it. It needs to be actually done by management. Or they have a system in place to help them manage it. Not an HRIS system, but a system. So they have 330,000 people. So changing the system means a huge effort. When they switched to the new system, they got rid of about 90% of the previous process. Reviewing it, changing it, updating it. Now they are using a more fluid performance management process where employees receive ongoing, timely feedback from management. This has been paired with a renewed focus on immediate employee development. So this is a focus on, if I see something, I have a conversation now. I don't wait until 6 months later. So there are a couple of common trends here. Each company has built a system that works for them in their culture and context, rather than following a one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one company might not work for all. And also, I think it's also important, if you look at the Adobe example, is it's not just putting a system in place and saying, well done, run with it. It's actually upskilling business to make sure that they understand the ultimate goal in terms of how they're trying to achieve it. I just want to have a quick check-in and see, from everybody on the line, what's your current feeling of where you are, given what you've seen around the case studies?
JP, as people are responding to that, I want to emphasize what we've highlighted there. And also coming back to the concept of best practice, leading practice, I always like to say that, it's only best practice and leading practice if it works for you. And that's what we highlighted here is, you need to think about your organization and look at, some of these case studies. We presented 5. Are there more? Yes, there are. What will work within your organization? So take, also, borrow brilliance, okay? Take from this, and put it together. But then very importantly, you need to consider what is required within your organization for this new system to work. If you're going to come in all of a sudden with frequent conversations, but your managers are struggling to have, annual or biannual, you need to take a step back and say, okay, but do we need to spend maybe a couple of months first preparing managers to have conversations before we now all of a sudden expect them to have monthly ones? So really think about how can you enable the organization. And I love what JP said, is the stigma is that, we're the HR is the policeman. They're the gatekeepers, the governance people. Judge Dredd, haven't done your performance review, you poor Mr. Line Manager. Okay, but how have you enabled them? Rather play a supportive role, be that performance leader within your organization. Let's have a look at some of the comments that came through.
So just from the comments, we are far behind. HR still drives PM process, no accountability from managers. Managers drive the performance process. HR is just a sense check for documents. Our company is mainly in sales, so weekly performance reviews are done as well as monthly. And I think you're touching on something very specific there, Tricia. So if you're looking at an ops environment, normally they have very robust performance conversations, because just as part of their operational conversations, they've got operational meetings, monthly check-in, weekly check-in, daily check-in sessions on sales targets, on throughput numbers, on items produced, because the business ultimately has to drive key specific numbers in that space, and they're quite harsh on people in sales environments if they don't make it. So that is a very good example of where business is driving that target in that space. The challenge comes to how you now translate that to the whole business. Environments where there's not as much hard or concrete targets, how do you create them? Then another comment was, some of my clients have quite a mature mid-management team, but I would say that is the exception rather than the norm. Most companies that I've worked with struggle with compliance. And I think it speaks to, I had this conversation with someone the other day, where they were like, they're so tired of driving compliance. They want to drive high performance. And I said, okay, let's take a step back and think of, if you were driving high performance, the value of a performance conversation would be implied, and you wouldn't have to drive compliance. You wouldn't have to drive getting KPIs or scorecards or whatever you want to call it in. If you are, as a human capital with your managers, driving high performance, ultimately the output would be that people would want to know where they are against that expectation. And naturally, performance conversations would come from that. Where if you're just trying to drive an HR process, it's an HR thing, I'll just do it to get them off my back. Then you ultimately, you're not getting what you want. You have to drive the upstream behavior to get the downstream compliance. So I think, thank you guys for the comment. Also, sales and marketing measured well, but the rest of the company and not a lot of blue collar workers. Okay. And I think as human capital, it's also our role to try and help business quantify what to look at. Help business identify what the outputs are in the spaces where there isn't clear targets, like a sales environment or marketing that looks at market share, engagements on platforms, clicks, that kind of thing. So, you know, it's our role to help business identify what that is. I'm going to move to the next section. I'm conscious of time. We're making good progress. So that the next one is, and please guys keep commenting, keep engaging. I'll revert to it as I'm going along. So I want to have a bit more of a deep dive on a more of a practical example on this. So we've done some high level trends, but I want to make use of an example where there's a very, very detailed example of how this is being practically applied. And funny enough, it's a Deloitte environment, and they've actually, you would know a couple of years ago, they've actually said, no, we're doing away with performance management. We are getting rid of it. This is not what we're going to be doing. But ultimately, they replaced it with a process that's still performance management, but it ticks those kind of boxes around how do we get there, and shifted the move away from just focusing on a score to a development conversation that ultimately leads to measuring where I am. So I want to quickly use this example. So when Deloitte redesigned their performance management process, they kind of said we have 3 objectives that we want to achieve through this. 1, they want to recognize performance. They've got a high performance culture. They want to recognize the guys that are performing well. 2, see each person's performance clearly. They were faced with 2 issues. 1 is the idiosyncratic rating effect and the need to streamline the traditional process of evaluation, project ratings, consensus meetings, final ratings, all of these things that we try and manage. The solution to the former requires a subtle shift in their approach. Rather than asking more people for their opinion of a team member in a 360 rating, for example, they found that all they needed to do was ask the immediate team leader, but critically to ask them a different kind of questions. So what they looked at is at the end of every project, which could be a week project or a 2-week project or a 5-month project or a quarterly project, they would ask the team leaders to respond to 4 focused statements. 1, given what I know of this person's performance, and if it were my money, I would award this person the highest possible compensation increase and bonus. So what this measures, it looks at overall performance and unique value to the organization on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So if I had to give you the money, would you pay this person the highest price? 2, given what I know of this person's performance, I would always want him on my team. Measures ability to work well with others and on the same 5-point scale. 3, this person is at risk for low performance, identifies problems that might harm the customer or the team. And 4, the person is ready for promotion today, measures potential on a yes or no basis. So all of this takes 2 minutes. On a weekly or quarterly or monthly basis, takes 2 minutes to complete. How am I perceiving this person's performance? When they aggregate the data points over a year, weighting each according to the duration of a given project. So if you had a longer project, they add more weighting. They produced a rich stream of information for leaders, discussions of what they in turn will do, whether it's a question of succession planning, development paths, or performance pattern analysis. And then what they would do is then if one of those, if you have a normal trend in terms of performance, but there's an outlier, it was the manager's responsibility then to go and do due diligence with the project manager to understand what happened on that project, what was the driver of non-performance or low performance, and then kind of give that qualitative data in there. The third objective that they wanted to achieve, they also factored some uncountable things such as the difficulty of projects assignments in a given year and contributions to the organization other than formal projects. So this will be firm contribution, proposals and that kind of thing. So the data will serve as the starting point for compensation, not the end point. So whether you were rated on these things was not the determining factor on what your compensation would be. The final determination would be reached either by a leader who knows each individual personally or by a group of leaders. So this used to be called fish tanks, an entire segment and at many data points in parallel. So walking into the room, there's leaders around in the room, and then through that, they have a conversation around all the scatter plots, all the firm contribution, qualitative, quantitative data, looking at then saying, okay, what do we do with this individual, development, succession, promotion, bonus increase. The third objective that they wanted to achieve was to fuel performance. So it wasn't just around measuring, but also to drive performance in the business. Research into the practices of the best team leaders revealed that they could conduct regular check-ins with team members about near-term work. These brief conversations allowed leaders to set expectations for upcoming week, review priorities, comment on recent work, and provide course correction, coaching, and important information. So if you had to think of, in the agile world, you'll think of stand-ups. So what Deloitte did here was they kind of formalized those stand-ups as part of your performance conversation and feedback conversation. So using an existing mechanism that exists in business and using it as, because the behaviors have been created, everything is there, everybody knows how to do it, using that as an input into your performance conversations and to drive development conversations, which meant each employee had immediate feedback on that day or week around what do I need to work on to improve my performance? Where am I slacking? Where am I not meeting the expectations? Then they designed calls for every team leader to check in with each team member once a week. These check-ins are not in addition to the work of a team leader, they are the work of a team leader. If a team leader checks in less often than once a week, the team leader's priorities may become vague and aspirational, and the leader can't be useful. The conversations will shift from coaching for near-term work to giving feedback about past performance. And also, if you think about, now immediately people would think, oh, this is such a tedious process. You know, I'm sitting with each person every single week. But if you think about it, it doesn't have to be a half an hour conversation. It doesn't have to be an hour conversation. It's a 10-minute or a 5-minute conversation. Let's have a quick check-in. How are you doing? Quick coffee at the canteen or wherever you meet. Let's have a quick chat, see where you're doing. This is our expectation for the next week. So for example, for my team, I have a monthly week planning with the whole team. Then I have morning stand-ups with the people in my team, not everybody is part of it, only the people for that stand-up is part of it. And it's a 1 or 2 person conversation, and I can quickly check in where everybody is, where is stuff lacking, course correct quickly, and then get back to work instead of waiting for a monthly meeting. Also, team leaders have many demands on their time. We've learned that the best way to ensure frequency is to have check-ins be initiated by team members who are more often than not eager for guidance. So remember, high-performing culture, I want to make sure that I'm high performing. I want to check where I am in this process. So it's not the manager's responsibility to set up these weekly check-ins. It's the employee's responsibility. They should be finding space in the diary. They should be making sure that that time is checked in. Also, the trigger from the system does not go to the manager. The trigger on the system for check-ins goes to the employee, and they have to confirm that they've done that check-in with that manager. So the governance around it isn't what did you discuss? What were the strengths? What did the development is? Have you done the check-in? Yes or no? Yes, I have. I've had the conversation to make it as easy as possible. Let's take a quick check there before we go to the activity. Is there any comments or questions or insights maybe from what I've just kind of put in front of you and kind of discussed? And it's such a clean example of incorporating all of these things. And then also having it be a system that brings in feedback.
JP, as the delegates sort of share their experience, I want to just highlight the one thing that we've articulated here, which is that the second sentence, they're under the second last component. These check-ins are not in addition to the work of a team leader. They are the work of a team leader. I think that is what every performance management system should strive for. If it is seen as additional work, then HR and the system has failed. It should be part of the conversation. Your conversations in your performance management process should not be done over and above. It should be an enabler for a manager to have those conversations. So I really want to stress that each person on this call and watching to this video afterwards, ask yourself the question, is this something that is over and above a day job? If your answer is yes, then you critically need to reevaluate the system that you've created. And we've shared some great examples now with a lot of things that you can borrow from to create something that will work within your environment. Okay, take some of this, you take some of that there. In the chat bar, I shared a great book that I encourage you all to read, which is Measure What Matters by John Dewar, really in great detail explaining the OKR process. We have very succinctly shared now, I think, a great example of how this can be achieved, and just looking at and reflecting on your responses as to what you believe the purpose of performance management is. All of that is encapsulated in here. It's about alignment to vision, alignment to personal goals and aspirations, alignment between what I'm doing and what I'm expected and what I need to do to close that gap. So it doesn't have to be that complex. You know, it's almost like back to basics that I think is sometimes required.
And I think it's also, Helena mentioned the key thing here as well is, remember, performance management is not, it's a my process. It's my performance. And I should be the one driving that. We also, from our side, drive it that the employee sets up the time with the manager. The employee comes prepared for the conversation. It's not me setting up time and driving it with the employee. And it's such a key, I think, mind shift that needs to happen to say that performance management is my priority. It's my work, it's my contribution. I should be checking on where I am in the process rather than the business setting up time to check in with me. So I think let's just, sorry, go.
Sorry, JP. And that's all definitely the theme that I'm seeing with those few objectives, that concept of ownership. I think when gathering the data, for it's 2 slides back, the first 2 questions were about if you, poised at the manager, if you were, let's say, the owner, how much money would you give this person for the performance, for their performance, which I think it's an awesome thing to bring into when capturing data from the manager's side. And also, once again, as you mentioned, bringing that ownership across from the employee side, that get your coaching sessions with your manager so we can help and understand, and you can bring ownership to what you want to achieve and develop in your performance with the company. So that's the take home that I'm going to take from this, is that fact that bringing that sense of ownership, that theme of ownership into performance management could definitely be advantageous.
No, definitely, Gerrit. I think that's such a key takeaway is it also shifts the focus away from the manager driving the process, because they become defensive. But I'm waiting for my employee, or I'm waiting for my employee. I don't have time. I can't get to this. They become defensive and they don't want to drive the process. Where if you put it into the employee's hands, you can say, okay, listen, these sessions haven't happened. It's the employees not driving it. Let's engage with the employees and see what's going on. Why are they not driving it? I think it's a small change, but I think it definitely speaks to what Trisha mentioned around the company culture. You know, if the employees and the managers buy into this process and encourage it, then it will work well. I think there's always been a narrative that's been depicted by big consulting firms, and a large portion of it also, like US companies, is kind of this narrative around we are a high performance culture. And with high performance comes certain positives and negatives, of advantages and disadvantages. And you know, the culture is one of those things that gets impacted the quickest with driving something like this. Also, what Trisha and I mentioned is if the employee views the measure of your performance as within your control and see the rewards from that performance, then it will work, definitely. So we're not saying necessarily to detach it from the processes, but see how do we align it better. So I want to have a quick activity before we go into our first break. Got about 15 minutes. What challenges do you foresee if you would radically change the performance management system in your company you work for? So if you had to think of your environment, your context, you know, we were walking into the room and saying, this is what you're going to be doing. If we use the Deloitte example as an example, what would be the first things you would think of would be some of the challenges you would face in your environment? So you can add in the chat box, or you can raise your hand or share. And then what is the one thing you could do to change or improve the performance management in your company?
Just a quick comment whilst people are responding and preparing to respond. I love the word that Gerard used there in terms of ownership. And I think that, in my experience, is what is very often lacking within, I think, many organizations, is the sense of ownership and the full appreciation of what the word ownership means. And if we reflect on, and if you've everyone on the call, if you've watched Chasing the Sun, the docu-series on the Springboks and how they won the World Cup. If you haven't yet watched it, I encourage you to do so.
Yeah.
One of the narratives that the then coach Rassie Erasmus brought into the room was the concept of you owning your position. So Makazole Mapimpi, you are the owner of the number 14 position. And that just takes it to a whole new level. Okay, you then have got a vested interest in making the best of that. I think it's Tom Peters who wrote the book Me Incorporated, the whole start of the personal brand. So you can have a read through that as well. But that is what is lacking in many organizations. Many systems, and I'm really interested to see what people are now responding as to what they want to change. Many systems is, no, this is HR's thing. But what we are saying, for a system to effectively work, there has to be a level of ownership. At an individual level, you need to take ownership for your career. You need to drive that process. It's not, but the company hasn't done this, the company hasn't done that. And when we start introducing that narrative to some of our clients, you met with significant resistance. Like, no, the company must do this. Like, no. What are you doing about it? Have you set up time with your manager? Have you had a conversation? Yes, we need to create a space and enable them to be comfortable with that. And we need to enable managers to create psychological safety so that they are comfortable. But I think we've got a long way to go to create that sense of ownership. And by creating a sense of ownership, that is when we will really see the benefits of a true integrated system that, to use our words, that fuels performance.
Any comments further? Anything that anyone wants to share from the activity perspective? If you had to think of bringing this to your business, how would you see them reacting to this?
So I think as we saw a response from Helena come through here, I really want to hear from the rest as well. I think one thing we can also consider is, as a result of COVID now, we're working remotely. Okay? Or it's a hybrid, a remote first, etc. Does these principles still apply? So we've got our thoughts on that. We want to hear what you guys are thinking. Does this apply? And we can explore that a bit after the break as well. Are there certain principles that is important irrespective of whether it's in person or remote? And are there certain things that you do differently because of potentially a remote team? I think many organizations are moving towards a matrix structure. We've got many multinational clients that works in a matrix structure. Is it the same? Is it different?
Definitely. And I think the appealing thing about this approach is, if you think of it from a manager perspective, is it breaks that bi-yearly annual review intensive 2-hour, 3-hour conversation up into 10, 15-minute check-ins throughout the year, which is much more manageable if the employee drives it than having a 2-3 hour conversation, which in certain companies actually becomes quite an intense conversation around their performance and expectations and misalignment, which now you've got one opportunity to address it in the year. And if you've diverted paths so much during the year between what your expectation of the employee was and what the employee's expectation of what your expectation was, diverge so far that when you have to have a performance review, the gap to close it just becomes so intense and so tiring and conflict ridden that it becomes a negative thing. But if you make small incremental changes over time, it makes a big impact. And if you think of the team, for those you know, cycling, for those of you who don't, there's a team that now it's called Ineos, but it used to be Team Sky, and they kind of had this principle of the 1% rule. So if we improve 1% every time, and you add up all those 1%, at the end we've shifted the dial significantly. Marginal gains, there we go, that's the correct term for it. So yeah, marginal gains, it's we don't have to be doing big stuff, big conflict, fighting around performance. Small incremental conversations shifts the dial over time. And if you think about your working relationship, it's not a relationship that's going to be 2 months. You're potentially working with this individual for multiple years. So rather than having those sessions where you're fighting, let's rather have those small changes that over time shifts our relationship in the way that we need it to be. I think that's it for our first half of our session today. Our next conversation is going to be getting into the meat of performance management. I think we've laid a good groundwork around kind of the big narrative around performance management, breaking it down into the key fundamentals around what we want to see or desire to see in performance management. Now we're going to kind of get into the more nitty-gritty things around, okay, but how do I practically do this and how do I actually drive this? Janko?
Yeah, I think fully agree, JP. I think we've had great conversation, and thanks everyone for your participation. Looking forward to further engage on this. What I suggest, as per JP's point, let's take a formal comfort break now. I have it as 10:22. So let's aim 10:35. It's a 13-minute comfort break. JP, you comfortable with that?
Yep, 100%.
I think that's enough time to quickly smash out 25 emails, have coffee and breakfast and all together, seeing that we are very efficient and effective in doing things in short periods. So 10:35, we start. You can just leave everything as is. We see you then, and then we're going to go into how do we actually do this? Okay, we've set the tone. We want to get more detail and share more detail with you. See you shortly.
Okay, let's get back into it. Thank you, everyone. I think it's a good break. I myself got myself a quick coffee just to keep the engine moving. So the next one we're going to be focusing on is effectively manage and measure performance. So a key thing I wanted to just focus on here is kind of what are the key things we need in a performance management process that makes sure that we are effective. So real trust can only grow when people know how the organization's performance will be judged. People align themselves around whatever is being measured, and that's why the scorecard is such a critical part of sharpening the focus. So kind of three things that we need in a performance scorecard is the metric. So that's what's going to be measured. So if we talk about that 5-point rating scale and we look at what that means, we shouldn't be using, for instance, doesn't meet expectations, meets expectations, exceeds expectations. We should be putting down a 3 is 20 sales, a 4 is 25 sales. Like really clearly put together what those metrics are. Also, what is the target? Like, okay, we're going to be measuring sales output. I need to sell 20 cars this month, for instance. Clearly put down what the target is. And then also understand where the current baseline is. It doesn't help if your target is unrealistic to meet given what the current performance is. So 3 things, what's going to be measured, what's the target, and basing that in what's the current baseline. So that's kind of the 3 fundamentals around performance management. If we think of the next one, we then say, okay, but these measurements look different at different levels. You're not going to have a measurement in place for an administrator versus a leader, it's going to look completely different because the outputs are expected to be different. And for those of you who are comfortable or have heard about levels of work, that'll kind of also speak to kind of what is the expected output, problem solving and judgment that we need at each level. So I just want to put up the chat here so I can see any comments that are made. Here we go. So if we look at kind of how these performance metrics cascade or kind of progress up the ladder, we still have our key 3 things there in terms of metric, target, and baseline. And we're measuring outputs when we're measuring these metrics and targets. You're measuring outputs, deliverables, not process. We're not measuring how much of something you're doing. We're measuring the output that you're trying to achieve. So if you look at the performance measurement chart there, you'll see in the beginning it's intellectual property, employees, and capital. Those are kind of your base things that you need in place to do work. If you are a supervisor, the type of activities you're going to be doing is you're going to be researching to find better ways to do your job, developing individuals and developing processes. Could potentially be manufacturing and could potentially be sales. If you go one step up, the type of metrics you're going to be looking at is how many product lines do we have, services that are rendered, customers that we engage with, customer metrics. If we look at the used by leaders, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? There is financial growth, customer retention, product reliability. Those are the type of measures we'll be looking at. The next one up is ultimate outcomes that we're trying to achieve from a societal perspective. You can go very broad with this, is educated society, happiness, improved health, environmental quality. So as you're progressing up this ladder in the business, you can see that it becomes very specific to much broader, because at that level, the context and the environment that you work in is much broader. There's not as much rigidity in place, but you can definitely put in, if you think about your business levers in terms of what you'd pull to make sure the business is performing, these are the type of things you'll measure your leader on. Like, is your product line successful? Is your customer experience NPO rating high? All of these things are something that you measure at a manager level or a head of level, but at the employee level, it's what's those specific targets I need to meet. So often what managers do is they dive too deep into the detail. They want to make 500 KPIs for the individual because they've basically taken the job description and just copied and pasted into the KPI document. But ultimately, your KPI document or scorecard or whatever you want to call it, it's not your job description. The job description is what you do. The performance scorecard is what you've achieved doing that job. And each year that changes. So yes, I am a HR manager, but each year the business has got different targets that they want to achieve, different outcomes they want to achieve. Each year the HR strategy has got different targets and things you want to achieve. If you think of a 5-year plan, you break it up into yearly targets, and then that year's target is what your performance agreement should look at, not the overall one. So think about that. There's different levels to KPIs. There's different inputs that come into making something happen, and there's different outputs that get delivered. If you also think of, from a performance perspective, there's also things called leading and lagging indicators. There's certain things that we can adjust now, and we can see the output now, and there's things that we can only see at the end once we have performed the work. The next one I want to quickly chat around is clarifying what output versus outcome is. When a large, and this is an example, when a large healthcare system in California started measuring health outcomes, a surprising thing happened. Patient health increased while at the same time healthcare costs declined. Why the surprising result? A major factor was that doctors started looking at the performance measures and teaming up to treat the sickest people. As a result, the number of frequent flyers, people who regularly sought medical care, decreased drastically. Because they narrowed their focus on what are the key things we need to focus on and what are key outcomes we needed to achieve, they inadvertently also reduced ineffective processes that they had in place. Paying attention to the outcomes pays off in big views, yet many companies fail to take the time to systematically figure out how to measure performance. As a result, the business doesn't flourish as it should. Instead, it stagnates. The next one is, it is important to take a holistic view at the organization and develop a set of performance measures that tracks outcomes rather than outputs. Information should then be communicated throughout the organization on a regular basis via forums in which people talk about performance, look at trends, and focus on areas where organizations are not meeting this target. So what you would sometimes hear about is when businesses talk about the business scorecard. And what that means is we've taken the business strategy, that's a 5-year, 10-year, whatever duration, and we've broken it down into what is our scorecard for this year? What are the key metrics that we need to achieve this year? Then you take that and you say, okay, if I had to look at this, what role does my finance team play? What role does my sales team play? What role does my HR team play in ensuring I get to this target? And then you put your targets in place in terms of meeting those things. The key thing here is by having a business scorecard, you're aligning everybody to what's that singular objective we're trying to achieve. Having a common set of goals speaks to our principles that we aligned to earlier, which is aligning, leading, and responding to changes in the market. And it's such a critical thing is to ensure that everybody's aligned to the right outcomes and not everybody's kind of diverting in all these different directions. Also, something that I think, just want to go back to the comments that I saw before. Helena mentioned that maybe breakaway rooms could be quite useful purposes, schedule weekly team catch-ups and use breakout rooms for smaller discussions, then get together as a bigger group to align weekly objectives. This speaks to that second point that I spoke about now is how do you communicate these goals regularly? So there's kind of different ways you can do this. There's town halls, CEO sessions, where you can kind of have like a broad communication of the goals, but you can also have it in your mancos, in your stratcos, you can have it in your team check-ins, you can have breakaway sessions on a weekly basis, check where we are in line with what we're trying to achieve. There's different methods that you can use at different levels to get that message across. Something as simple as putting a company target on the wall where everybody sees it and everybody walks past it every day entrenches what we're trying to achieve as a business and aligns people to it. You will see a lot of, especially in the mines, they do it quite well from a safety perspective. They put up a tracker to say we are 100,000 fatality-free shifts, or we are 1 million fatality or injury-free shifts. And they kind of have like a very visual representation. I know that one mine used the bull, and then that bull will fill as the shifts go past that there haven't been injuries, or they've got like a barometer on a wall, like a thermostat that fills as we progress. And then there's recognition points across when we hit certain targets. So there's many things you can put in place to visualize the company goals. Something as simple as working it into your monthly or weekly team management session. At the top, you just have what are the key things we're trying to achieve for the year. Every week we look at it, every week we see it, and every week we understand what we're trying to achieve. Through this, you build trust. Through this, you understand I am accountable for my goals. I am accountable for what I'm trying to achieve. And you build a higher level of success because no one is lost in what they're trying to achieve or what their value add is. And also what it adds to it is sometimes in a big organization, employees don't understand what their value add is to this big strategy. So they see the CEO present this beautiful conceptual model or outcomes you're trying to achieve, and I've got no idea how I contribute to that. By cascading these things down in the business and working it into all the various channels in your business, the more visible it becomes of how my role is valuable and how I contribute to the bigger picture. So that's the difference between outputs and outcomes. The next one I want to talk to you is kind of when things go wrong. So we know now we've got these different levels of KPIs or outcomes we're trying to achieve, focusing on specific things depending on what department or level you are at. We've spoken about what are the key pillars of performance management, why we do it. And we've spoken about kind of what is the right thing to do in terms of performance management. But we also know that things can go wrong, you know, and it helps us to reflect against those things, to also understand, to identify them in the workplace. So the first one is poor metrics. The metrics that a company chooses must actually promote performance it wants. Usually it can achieve this only by incorporating several of them into a balanced scorecard. So remember that company scorecard. Problems arise when that doesn't happen. Example, some manufacturing plants, for example, still set overall production targets for each shift individually. Since each shift's incentives are based only on its own performance, not on the performance of all shifts for the entire day, workers have every incentive to decide whether they can complete a full unit of work during their shift. If they think they can, they start and complete a unit. But if they don't, they may slow down or stop altogether towards the end of the shift, because otherwise all the credit for finishing their own uncompleted work go to the following shift. Each shift therefore starts with little or no work in progress, which cuts down productivity. So what that means is I need to do 20 units for my shift. It's 50 minutes left of my shift. I'm busy with the unit. I'd rather stop completely and not start a new one, because I know the next shift's going to pick up that, and then they're going to be recognized for it. So having shift targets, for instance, in certain contexts might not be the right metrics to measure. And there needs to be a bigger focus. Also, poor targets, so unrealistic, unmeasurable, all those kind of things. And this is unfortunately a science and an art. You need to understand what your business can measure and can't measure. If they are too easy, they won't improve performance. It's easy for me to reach it. And I've got an example of this where I had a friend who was a medical sales rep, and he was very good at his job. And because the company set the target for him, he worked very hard for the first 2 weeks of the month, met his target. And then he's like, well, I've met my target now, so I'm going to stop. So the next 2 weeks of the month, he was on holiday. He didn't work more. He didn't sell more because he's met his target for the month. And, you know, but they're measuring the wrong thing, which leads to the wrong behavior. So 2 weeks of the month, he's working hard. He's meeting his targets. The rest of the month, he's got a holiday. If they are too far to reach, staff won't even try to hit them. An example of this is to set such targets. Companies most often overcome cultural barriers. In some Asian organizations, for example, missing targets is considered deeply embarrassing. So managers tend to set them too low, where in the United States, by contrast, setting a target lower than one achieved in a previous period is often deemed unacceptable, even if there are valid reasons for change. Such a prime example of this is when I was still working in consulting. What would normally happen is you would scope the project, you know, say, these are the resources I need. I need 6 weeks to do this project. The client would come back and say, I can only pay for 4. You're like, okay, cool. What we'll do is we'll cram everything. We don't reduce the work. We'll cram everything into 4 weeks so that we use less work hours. And then we know we can deliver against the client. But now you finish the project, everybody works late, everybody works overtime, gets the job done, everybody's happy. The next time they scope that project, they scope it to say, well, we can do this in 4 weeks for you. The client says, I can only pay for 3. The person might be a new manager, a new sales agent. They don't understand the context behind the previous project. They're like, oh, okay, cool, I'll scope it for 3, not knowing that the previous one was done in 4 with a lot of effort, long hours, and under-resourced. So now you start stretching that target so much that the person physically can't achieve it. And then they just become demoralized and don't want to engage with it. So I think that's kind of where the targets come in. And then the last one is lack of transparency, which speaks to employees have to believe their targets encourage meaningful achievement. People are not stupid. They will know if you put a KPI in there that doesn't make sense to them or the business, they'll know. It's as clear as that. They need to understand how that feeds back into the business. Frequently, however, the link between individual effort and company objectives is obscured or gets diluted as metrics and targets cascade through the organization. Different levels of management, in an attempt to boost their own standard, or ensure against underperformance or elsewhere may insert buffers into targets. So I know my team works at 80% capacity. My target's 100. So I'm going to actually make the target 120 instead of 100. But now the whole company talks about 100 and everybody's like, but why are you putting us at 120 versus 100, for instance? So it's about transparency in that space and not actually trying to fix one problem with another problem. Metrics at one level may have no logical link to those further up the cascade. So those are kind of the three main issues that we sometimes see from a KPI perspective. And then this is kind of an example of performance at every level. In the performance management system, the entire organization operates from a single verified version of truth, and all employees understand both the organization's overall performance and how they contributed. Remember, we cascade it down, we discussed it in all our forums, we put it up visually. So leaders adapt and cascade performance indicators to all staff levels. So these are kind of examples of, performance indicators for the different levels, and then also kind of what's the action words used associated with it. So if you look at a CEO, normally a quite normal measurement that's used for them is kind of EBITDA, earnings before income, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And that's basically profit. That's what's left at the end after everything's been deducted, basically. And then normally the action is our key value driver is production. Because the more you drive production, the more you control cost, the more your EBITDA will grow. If we look at general manager, if the CEO's drive is, okay, we need to drive production, their annual performance indicator or the performance indicator might be annual production as a measurement. And they'll have quarterly or monthly check-ins from a production perspective. And their action will be, we must identify bottlenecks and recurring equipment problems, because for him, immediately he thinks of, okay, I need to meet a certain output. So I need to go and identify what's holding me back from achieving that. What's keeping me from getting there? And it's bottlenecks and it's equipment potentially in the space. So he then goes and talks to his operational manager and he's like, listen, operational manager, you need to help me find this because this is what's hampering us from getting the production. So automatically daily production is his performance indicators. Compressors COO, for instance, is an example, because that's one of the bottlenecks they've identified for that year. And so magically an action for him is compressor trip is a major recurring problem. We need to resolve the root cause. So that is one of the key focus areas for him. So automatically he's going to go in and talk to his supervisor, have a performance discussion. These are the things I need you to look at. I need you to look at shift production and shift training. Firstly, we need to train them on the compressor, make sure that that they're handling it and maintaining it effectively, and that they're using it effectively in the shift. So their action is going to be root cause identified. We need to train operators to follow cleaning procedures. He's then going to go to his operator and say, listen, I'm not training you to do this effectively, but I'm also going to measure you on this. So if I look at your compressor cleaning procedures, this is a measurement that I'm putting in place, which is SOP to the power of 3 adherence, which is a kind of chemical and cleaning procedure. And he's okay, we will follow these procedures kind of as an action item. So you kind of see how these things cascade down. And you've got, if you work at that top level, there's multiple of these levers coming out. We're looking at annual production as one here as an example. But you cascade these across the business. And then targets must be tailored to each level to be meaningful. It doesn't help I put in their shift production into the CEO's scorecard. They don't have any power over it, like at that level. They don't have any direct input, direct actionable measurements at that level. They should be actually leveled at the right level, measured at the right level. So you see how these things kind of cascade down and ultimately also cascade back up. So by us making sure that this operator performs correctly, then the supervisor, then the operations manager, then the general manager, then ultimately it'll lead to the CEO making his target and ultimately the business being sustainable and financially viable. I want to take a quick sense check here. We've spoken about all these kind of key elements of performance management. Is there any questions that we have so far around this? And while you're typing, maybe the key thing I would want to just emphasize here is you need to understand your business to guide them on this. You need to be close to your managers and your business to understand what these metrics are, so that when they put stuff in that doesn't make sense, you can actually push back and say, listen, if I'm looking at the job that you're trying to achieve, these measures don't make sense, and actually help them and be an advisor to guide them through this process. Any questions?
I think, JP, just as people are responding, to your point there is, and we alluded to this in the live Q&As as well, is the HR professional needs to have the ability to ask questions. And again, very often, company strategy year on year, you just add 10%, etc. We really need to ask the questions. And I think it's a great example that you've positioned here in terms of how can you effectively cascade that. And this is just from a metric perspective, and we've shared sort of the 3 critical components of what is required in order to have effective conversations. Really prompt your managers to consider this, but why are we measuring this? How is this, moving the needle? Align it in future to your purpose, to your ultimate vision. And that's where a system like the OKR system, is a great mechanism and a great tool that you can ultimately use, because it's an inborn desire for any human being to understand how they fit into a bigger picture. Where I'm a little piece of the puzzle, where do I fit in? How do I contribute? And again, our experience is that not enough thought is given to what your metrics are, and are those metrics linked to the overall purpose of the organization?
No, definitely, Janko. And I think the one thing I wanted to add there was also, we have the cascade here, and we're using a production environment because it's easy to understand kind of the flow. But what you'd see there is the performance indicators are measurable. We can pull financial data on EBITDA. We can pull production data on annual production. We can pull maintenance records on the compressors tripping. We can pull shift data and checklist on standard operating procedures followed. And that's the key thing that we speak about when we speak about metrics and targets, is identifying what are the metrics we can measure, and then looking at the targets that need to be achieved. And if we don't have an objective measure, how can we design one to then make sure that we get there? So for instance, something that's sometimes a bit intangible is customer feedback. Be that external customer feedback, which you can get quite easily, but internal feedback. If I'm working for a human capital department and I need to engage with my stakeholders, and I'm working with them as a value-added business partner, and at the end of the quarter, monthly, weekly, yearly, I need to get feedback on how am I adding value to that space. Instead of going, I'll just ask them and get some qualitative data, design something where they can give you feedback and a qualitative measure that you can actually objectify your value add. You can actually see what the analytics are. Look at, decrease in IR cases, increase in performance metrics and contribution, increased measures of training in the space, decrease absenteeism. Like, put those metrics in place that you can then see what the value add is in that business. Work with your team, work with your IR specialist if you have, work with your payroll people to understand and get specific data to that business area if you need to break it down to their level and see how the shifts have been happening. One of the key areas where this has happened a lot is that when you look at engagement, a lot of people have engagement measures, engagement actions, and they've really quantified a lot of that stuff quite well. But how do we quantify the rest? And how do we make sure that things happen? So keep that in mind when we're working and how we're going. If we look at the common pitfalls, just to recap it, we look at lack of relevance of the goal, lack of dialogue, conversation around it, lack of consequences if something goes wrong, and lack of management engagement in the process, like we've discussed earlier. Okay, we've got that. I'm going to skip this activity just because of interest of time. I want to get to the next one, and we'll incorporate it into the next activity. So employee engagement. So ultimately, the reason behind performance management or performance enablement or development discussions is to keep your employees engaged in the workforce, keep your millennials, keep your Gen Zs, keep your workforce engaged and have them perform. So if we look at, how do you drive engagement within this performance management landscape? The first thing I would like to talk to is kind of on the right there, refrain from creating tension. So, it's not about having conflict, it's about having courageous conversations. When we talk about refraining from creating tension, it's not about necessarily not having those hard conversations, but not creating an emotional loaded environment consistently. The next one is identify the most positive in your team and leverage off of them. So the guys were there's this very interesting TED talk around a coach that shifted his focus around how he encouraged and engaged and rewarded performance within his team. And what he did was, instead of telling the kid who did something wrong that he did something wrong, he would rather tell the kid that did the action correctly, well done, and then the kid would see that that is actually being rewarded and shift their behavior. So identify those key performers in your team, recognize them, and recognize the behavior that you want to drive. So don't go around like favoritism, but recognize the behavior that you want, and the team will see what they need to gravitate towards. Share your achievements and your failures to initiate drive. So we talk a lot about psychological safety, and psychological safety speaks about creating an environment where I feel I can share my concerns and fears and anxieties and feedback. So you as a leader create an environment where I can share those achievements. Consistency is key. We actually had a conversation about this last night after the show, where we spoke about a lot of people start quite vigorously and they drive stuff and stuff happens. And then 2-3 months later, it kind of dies down. They revert back to their normal procedures or their normal behaviors, and it kind of gets lost in the making. So I think an important thing for us is rather start off slower, build consistency, than try and do massive action immediately. Allow them to influence, it's not a top-down driver. It is, although we align top down, it's also a bottom up feedback process. And then build confidence to discover potential. Create a safe environment for your team to experiment and try and test and see what happens, and let them feel safe around making mistakes. Still being accountable, but make them feel safe around making mistakes. And then this is kind of a nice example of, and I've seen this many a time around giving performance feedback. Normally, just after you give performance feedback, there's a natural spike in performance. It is a kind of I'm trying to think of what the term is here, Hawthorne effect, where you are made aware of something and then immediately you focus on it and trying to correct it, but then you kind of dissolve over time, which I spoke about now. But if you do regular check-ins like we've positioned earlier, you kind of have that spike, and eventually that spike becomes where the new baseline is set for performance. So through a culture of more autonomy and risk-taking and open opportunities and creating a safe environment for them to achieve, overall your performance starts shifting as well through frequent feedback. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick activity now. I'm going to incorporate the previous one with this one. So if you look at performance management in general, and you can share, you can unmute yourself, put up your hand. What are the key challenges that you've experienced with performance scores or metrics? And also, how often have you received feedback on those from your manager? If you had to think about what you've experienced in the past, you don't have to talk about your current company, maybe in past experiences. And maybe, do you agree with giving regular feedback? So what challenges have you experienced with metrics and being measured for performance? Have you received regular feedback, and do you think it's valuable from your experience?
JP, I want to add, as people are busy responding, just sort of another flavor to that is, if you haven't yet experienced it, what do you think in the system prevented that from happening? So what was the hurdles to the system providing you with regular feedback? Let's hear some thoughts.
Okay, so we had one there. Some challenges with metrics felt very unachievable. So PM and feedback process felt very disheartening, definitely. And it has a cascade effect. So if your metric and your target is unachievable, like we spoke about earlier, immediately the conversation navigates away from development and how do I help you close the gap to I'm completely discouraged around this and I've got no interest to even try and close the gap. Also, we look at feedback should be done regularly, not only when you've done something wrong. Once a year as a paper exercise, no value add. KPIs airy-fairy. I've heard this so many times. I think that's why it's so critical as a human capital practitioner and an elite HR practitioner to make sure that you are that person who can push back to business and say, listen, clearly this is not going to work. You're trying to just bluff yourself and your team, and we're not actually. If I look at the business target and I look at your target, or I look at the department target and I look at your target, there's no alignment for me here. And also, good if you put in a consistent practice of feedback, whether the person's performed well or not, they know it's happening. Where if you only give feedback when things go wrong, automatically they associate feedback negatively. You're going to tell me I've done something wrong. But if you do consistent feedback, that kind of ensures that irrespective if it's positive or negative, you kind of you have a regular check-in. Received feedback felt like a ritual. Thanks, Elizabeth. Little depth on interest from manager and helping set up development actions to remedy lack of achievements. Definitely, if you don't put out enough time to talk through development actions around performance, it will feel like the only focus is just meeting the targets and measuring that, and then development becomes kind of a back end. We'll set up another session next week, never happens. So make sure you've got enough time to work through these things.
Maybe just a comment on that. You know, I'm taking it back to a comment I made earlier. That is the case, you know, as per Elizabeth's comment, if there's a lack of ownership and if there isn't a full appreciation of the impact the right type of conversation can have. If a manager does it because the system demands it, you know, we need to work on that sense of ownership. A leader and a manager of people need to understand that they achieve results through others. You know, that's a very, it's a very difficult thing for people to get a grip of. You know, you mentioned levels of work earlier. You know, we can have a separate conversation on that, but the higher up you go in an organization, the less responsible you are, but the more accountable you are. So your results and your KPIs are achieved through others. So your concern, as we said earlier, is the upskilling of others. You need to own the process of making others better. That should be your concern. It's not about doing the job. It's not about writing copy for a, you know, for a report or whatever. That should be your concern. And if you have full ownership and you understand the role of a manager, the role of a leader, then you will have a vested interest in having an authentic and sincere conversation with the people reporting to you. And then, Elizabeth, it should not feel like a sort of a tick box exercise and a bit of a ritual. It can be a ritual if the right sentiment and motivation is there. So if you agree with your manager, every second Friday we have a formal check-in, but there's also you know, regular conversations. And yes, embrace that ritual. You know, if you've got a favorite coffee spot that you guys go to, you know, do that. But then the sentiment and the drive behind the conversation has to be sincere, it has to be authentic, has to be non-judgmental. It has to be to uplift the employee. You know, it's Einstein who said, you know, that he could only see so far because he stood on the shoulders of giants. And, you know, it's my plea to many managers to have that mindset that, look, If I lift the level of thinking of the people reporting to me, I will automatically lift my level of thinking. But you can only do that if you really own a process and you believe in the value add of that process.
No, and I definitely agree there, Janko. I always say to people that, you know, your relationships at work with your colleagues and your team, it's still a relationship, just as you have a relationship with your wife or your fiance or your family members. You're definitely not going to sit with your wife or fiance once a year and say, listen, let's have a conversation around your performance in my relationship or our relationship, and I'll give you a score around how you've achieved against my expectations. You'll definitely have a different conversation then. But you definitely have regular conversations with your better part of your spouse around, you know, how things are going, how things are not working, what we need to work on, what's going well, regular, consistent feedback or like appraisal or love, or, you know, showing admiration. So I think of it like that. It's you'd never do that with your friends, your family, or the people around you. So why would you do that with your team? Have regular conversations and engagements. I want to talk about the importance of feedback. I don't want to go too deep into this because we're going to have a separate session on this and kind of build this out, because this is quite a chunky component of this. I'll maybe just lightly touch on it, and then we can kind of almost get to a point where we have like a little bit of a conversation at the end of the session where we just wrap up all the learnings for today. So if I think of feedback in general, you know, there was a recent study done that they looked at 75 out of 100 of employees feel that feedback is valuable, but less than 30 out of the 100 receive it. So if you think about that, remember, this is from the perception of the employee. So you might be thinking, I'm giving you feedback, but the employee doesn't recognize that it's feedback. So it's important to clearly articulate when you're giving feedback, one, and two, people want feedback. People want to receive feedback and understand where they are. If we look at the high-level process of feedback, and I'm going to do 2 more slides around feedback, and then we're kind of going to go into a conversation piece now around it in general. There's kind of like the normal thing around feedback, you know, create a plan, you execute, you check, you monitor, and then you give corrective actions around it. A key thing is, if you take this into the context of performance management, the whole goal of performance management is feedback. So this process still applies. So this process actually applies even more now around, you know, you plan when you're sitting down. It's not just you walking into the room unprepared for your performance discussions or your check-ins or your feedbacks, your weekly or monthly or quarterly or yearly. You come in prepared to have the right type of conversation. Also, you need to execute on your feedback plan. A lot of people put IDPs in place and kind of, we'll check in it in a year and see how it's going. But it's an active process to drive. Always keeping in mind, if you have a team, what are the development actions I'm working on? How can I create exposure opportunities for them? How can I create an environment where they can develop those skills? Because ultimately, if you think of a business, the work is done at the employee level, and the consolidation and correction is done at management. So your goal, like Janko said, and your job is managing people. Then you check and monitor consistent feedback. It's not just documents somewhere in the closet. And then initiate action plan into a system. So whether that's an actual system, like an HRIS system, or just a system that manages and tracks it, that we can keep a view of what's happening and what hasn't been happening, what development areas have been addressed. And then also what happens is then from there, you then need to make sure that you ensure that you create those action steps that then align to performance. So a key thing here is ensuring that, you know, things happen and things are in place and things are developed, and you put it down to what needs to be done. And then the last one I want to just quickly chat about is continuous feedback, just giving a little bit more detail around it. We'll dive into more specific things about the neuroscience around feedback, but basically you have to plan, do, check, and act like we've discussed now. So if you look at plan, there's no point in giving feedback if you are unsure of what the feedback are you meant to be providing. The feedback that you plan should be based on hard facts and not memory of your experiences. So we have we spoke about biases in our first session, I think, first or second session. Those recency biases, things that you've seen in the last week influencing performance discussions. That's why those key measurable metrics are so important, to ensure that you have something that's objective to measure around and that your biases doesn't start playing in. The first step aims to explore information, define the feedback you receive, you will deliver, generate ideas in terms of which feedback mechanism you can use, whether that's weekly, monthly, team check-ins, huddles, breakaway sessions. Then also, after the strengths and development areas of your employees have been identified, you can then check that the system, you can now check the system with a pilot project. You can see how things run before you actually implement it. And this will help you identify whether the recommended changes you propose will elicit the desired outcome. So something like this, for instance, is, let's say we identify through the performance management process that you need to explore project management more. Before I send you on maybe a very costly performance management course, or I second you into a performance management project, let me give you a small little project management activity to complete where you run your own project. Okay, you currently run projects, put a project plan together for me. Let's see what happens. Run the project on what you know currently. See if there's actually something there around driving it further, rather than running down a rabbit hole that ultimately doesn't deliver anything. Also check, once you have conducted the pilot project, you can now compare the results to your initial expectations. If there is a connection between your expectations and the project, you can now implement the plan. And then lastly, act. Once you are satisfied, you can implement the process, and it's called continuous feedback for a reason. So I want to kind of stop there before we go into the more detail about feedback. And I want to kind of get to a point where we just have a little conversation at the end of the day around everything that we've discussed today. I know it's a lot of information, and I know it's a lot of things to think about, especially from a mind shift perspective, a way of work and a way of measuring it. So let's have a quick chat around, where everybody is at the end of the session, and if there's anything that we need to make sure we clarify before we close out for the day.
JP, yeah, just to your point, as the delegates respond, maybe part of the question to everyone here is, I want you to think about something that you improved on. It doesn't have to necessarily be a work-related activity. It can be a personal, a hobby, whatever the case might be. How did you improve? Okay, what was the process that you followed to improve? So I'm interested in some thoughts on that, because I'm guarantee you, if you break it down, it comes down to these steps here. I think, great advice that JP gave in terms of that little pilot. So we see that lacking in many organizations and systems, where they just head straight to, I don't know, just do an MBA, like 300K, 2 years of your life at Henley or Gibbs or whatever the case might be. Yeah, it's prestigious. You can pump it on your LinkedIn profile, but is that really what you needed? Because what sits behind the concept of continuous feedback is the process and the practice of deliberate practice. In last night's live Q&A, which you'll find on the Human Interest YouTube channel, I referred to the concept of deliberate practice, made famous by Malcolm Gladwell and based on the work by Anders Ericsson in his book Peak. So if I can use myself as a quick example on where this actually comes in, it's a bit of a sporting analogy. So I'm on a bit of a drive to up my golf game. Okay? So I want to play better golf. It's really frustrating to not be on the fairway all the time, and then you sugarcoat it and you say, hey, you know, I'm paying a lot of money, I want to use the entire course, I want to play from that bunker and I want to play from that side of the fairway. No, ultimately you just want to play down the fairway. Okay, you want to be on the green in 2 on a par 4. So I invested in coaching. So I had a golf instructor standing next to me for 8 lessons, and as I do my swing, you know, he's telling me, you could do this, do that, do this, do that. I'm not taking offense. I want to hear that so that I can improve. In business, we sometimes very often take offense if a manager tells you how you can improve. I don't know why we take things personal in business, but I'm willing to pay someone to tell me how to improve outside of work. Okay, I think that's again where the concept of ownership again comes in. So now I've got this going, and we practice with a 7-iron. Okay, just practice my swing, fix it. I had a tendency to push the ball to the right, and it's like, okay, it's because my swing path is this and my club face is doing that, etc., etc. Now, after about 6 weeks of just playing with a 7-iron, he said, okay, let's take out the big dog. Let's bomb some drivers. So okay. So now I'm hitting drivers. Okay, and I'm a pretty decent driver, I think, you know. And he's getting like all excited. He's like, oh man, I think you can like do long drive. And I'm like, oh yeah, I want to do long drive, champs. You know, that sounds great. You know, your swing speed has to be this, etc. Because I'm hitting it over the driving range. So I'm carrying the ball 290, 300 meters, which is significantly further than the PGA to a professional average. So now we hook up the TrackMan and we're testing. Because at that point in time, before the test, and that's why I'm sharing this example, you know, we're looking at where do we buy long drive clubs and etc. All excited about this thing. And then we hook up TrackMan and we see, but wow, there's a lot of things that I actually need to work on before I'm ready for long drive champs. Before I now go and spend 15,000 Rand on a driver, because it's a different driver to what you play a normal golf game with. So now we know that. So he said, okay, now go and work on this for a 6-month period. So do a bit of a pilot. Okay? And then we come back and we check and we test your swing speed again and we test your ball speed again, because it has to be at a certain standard before I can proceed. So just like first standing there, it'll look great. You know, I want to do performance management. Oh yeah, you know, do Prince 2 certification. That is the equivalent of me going and buying this. Now, as JP said, you know, first do that little test. Checked it and then act on it. So what is our plan of action now? I've got 6 months. I need to work on the swing. I need to work on my hip rotation a lot more. Okay, I'm doing it. He is checking it. We've got conversations going, and then we will act to see. But okay, let's take it further. Let's now do that MBA. Let's do that Prince conversation. Let's do a formal rotation, 6-month assignment. You've spent a week there. We got good feedback. Etc. So make sure and think about practices where it was very deliberate, where there were small steps, where you planned for what it is that you want to improve on, and be open to feedback in a business environment. It's a plea. Be open. Don't take offense. We're going to talk about in the next session, as JP said, there is the how. The how is important. Okay, but if you really take ownership for your development, then you won't take offense if someone gives you instructional advice to be better.
Yeah, thank you, Janko. And I think let's have a quick check-in where everybody is. You can unmute yourself, you can raise your hand, you can put in the comment box. If you had to think of what we've discussed today, do you have a better understanding of performance management in general and kind of how you would approach it? Let's get some feedback from everyone. We're done for the day, everyone. We're just closing out and getting some feedback. So you're more than welcome to share, type. Thank you there, Elizabeth. Better understanding. Gap is obviously an implementation, definitely. And like what we've said before is like the principles behind performance management has existed for many years. It's what we try to show you today is practically how can we better implement it to then get to those ultimate goals.
We have a raised hand from Victoria. Victoria, do you want to unmute and participate?
Yes, please. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
It's Victoria Springbok over here. Like, I just want to mention like a comment, like this whole performance management strategy and the implementation thereof is quite beneficial towards what you guys have said. But I wanted to ask a question. Does people analytics and business intelligence also evolve around this? How can you link those components within this performance management arena, if you put it like that? Thank you so much.
So I'll answer here. So I think where people analytics comes in is it doesn't change the framework. The framework is still the same. Where it comes in is around those KPI measurements that you put in place. You know, how do you measure those? In the past, it's been something that's been measured quite subjectively, and which has caused frustration around that. But the more objective you can make those, the more you bring in data to support those achievements, the more you bring in analytics to visualize how you're actually tracking and progressing and how you visualize the achievements of those objectives or outcomes, the more face value your performance management has, the more face value your ultimate achievement of it has. And a key example where you can have a very quick win on this is, let's say there's specific KPIs across the board in everybody's scorecard. You know, target those to automate those. So let's say everybody has to drive employment equity, for instance, as an example. You know, that is something you can very easily automate from a recruitment process to say, what were our targets? How did we achieve them? How did we map against them? Automate the measurement of that, and then make an analytic around it to then show progression and tracking against targets. That automatically gets sent out in terms of performance reviews, or gets worked into the performance review automatically without the manager having to do anything, which simplifies one KPI, one outcome in that project. So if you can start working systematically, looking at what are the ones we can kind of automate the quickest and the easiest, and bring in analytics into that, the more buy-in you'll have in the process, and the easier it'll be for people to understand. So that's kind of where I see analytics and data coming in. It's actually the measurement of the outcome. I hope that answers your question, Victoria.
Thank you so much. I have a better idea and understanding of it right now. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else? Okay.
Great. So, colleagues, yeah, thanks a lot for your time, your active participation. As we positioned at the beginning, this was our first EliteHR Masterclass. We trust that you found it valuable. We will be hosting these sessions on a monthly basis going forward. One of the planned sessions JP has already alluded to, and that really talks around, you know, how do you give feedback? How do you provide advice? How do you create, you know, that environment where people are open to the concept of deliberate practice? And in that, we'll explore a bit of the neuroscience behind it. There's a couple of frameworks that we want to share that we, you know, personally found quite valuable. Another one that we are also leaning towards for future sessions, and we briefly touched on it last night, is the whole concept around leader development. So in this world of work, you know, how do we really develop leaders, and what are the core competencies that managers and leaders need to have? And then we encourage you to share your thoughts with us, you know, share with us as to, you know, sticky issues, things that you want to do a bit of a deep dive on. We will be continuing with our live Q&A as we've done so successfully over the last 3 months. This is a new component, so please do share with that, and spread the love. You know, share this with your friends, with your colleagues, with your clients. If you've got a client, or if you're a consultant yourself and you feel that, geez, you guys want to explore how we can collaborate in sharing this and getting the message out there. Reach out to me, reach out to JP. This really is about playing it forward. We want to capacitate and accelerate growth within the HR profession, so that ultimately, you know, the purpose of human interest is to create systems where every person can reach their potential and be their natural best. And this is one of the platforms, you know, in which we want to do that. So from our side, thanks a lot for your time. We wish you a wonderful rest of the Friday. Any other thoughts, ideas, you all have got my contact details. Please do reach out. JP, thanks to a job, great, well done, sharing your experience in a very practical way. As I said, we will make the full video available on the Human Interest YouTube channel. So you're welcome to share that as well once it has been uploaded. Obviously, if you subscribe, you'll get notified. Yeah, let's I see some comments coming through here. Let's just quickly have a look at that. Great, thanks a lot, Vilmarie. And thanks also for your support and for attending today's session. JP, in closing from your side?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining. You know, get more people on the platform, get more people involved. We are trying to, as far as possible, share knowledge, share experience, share what we know. We definitely don't know everything. And that's why these sessions we run as kind of engagements, conversations, and it's a platform for us as human capital professionals to ensure that, you know, we are an elite HR fraternity in the industry. And when business looks to us for insights and guidance, we are there to support them. So long things have been kept to ourselves in our little corner, and I know what I know and I'm not sharing it, and you know, you have to figure it out by yourself. But ultimately, as a fraternity, it's to the detriment of us all. So let's rather engage, share, learn from each other, elevate everyone, and it'll just be better for us in general.
Great, thanks JP. Thanks a lot everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. Connect with Human Interest on LinkedIn. We will shortly share more information, dates and times for our next live Q&A, as well as our next Elite HR Masterclass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.